We are studying the chapter titled Cosmic Consciousness, in which Sri Aurobindo not only describes the experience of what this consciousness is like as one lives in it, he also describes the gradations within the experience by which one rises into it. And in the passage we are at, he discusses the limitations of the experience when it is not perfect. And it is not perfect because we are still mental beings. And the mind tends to divide something of reality because it is unable to hold the fullness of its oneness. The mentality, when it arrives at the idea or realization of the spirit, the divine, tends to break existence into two opposite halves, the lower and the higher existence. It sees on one side the infinite, the formless, the one, the peace and bliss, the calm and silence, the absolute, the vast and pure. On the other, it sees the finite, the world of forms, the jarring multiplicity, the strife and suffering and imperfect, unreal good, the tormented activity and the futile success, the relative, the limited, and vain and vile. Now he's showing you two extremes with a series of terms describing each of these. The mind, when it looks at reality of the one divine consciousness, it tends to split it into this, the higher and the lower. But as we saw, there's in fact a link. There is a continuum between the two. But the mind is unable to hold this continuum, hold or experience this continuity. For that, one needs to shift consciousness to a higher grade, which is not based on comparing and differentiating. Our very starting point is a mind as a tool. In order to understand this flower, I must look at the not flower. I must cut it out from its background to be able to isolate it and say, this is flower. I must separate and contrast, compare, differentiate, and understand. Or break it up and rejoin to be able to say, yes, it's made of so many petals. But there is a consciousness higher up, just a little bit, the intuitive consciousness, which will look at flower and not say this is made of 25 petals arranged in this particular form. It will look at flower and feel identity of flower and say, it is beautiful. And that's the intuitive consciousness. And it feels, it knows by feeling from within out. Already that can begin to experience the world differently. Through all this strife and struggle, it feels behind, there is a harmony which is trying to express. There's a delight behind the appearance of struggle. And it's able to feel it. But still it may not be able to reconcile, because it is an operating in the realm of finites. And one rises still higher into a grade of consciousness, which Sri Aurobindo calls the overmental, which then is able to embrace the whole, but from a perspective, from an angle, from a bias, until it rises into the one consciousness of the divine, the creative power of the divine, the supramental, in which it knows the whole oneness as the divine knows it. It knows the oneness, it knows the multiplicity and the continuum and the perfect arrangement of why things are the way they are in relation to each other in an unfolding sequence. Everything is perfectly placed and so beautiful. Wonderful, adbhuta. This is the word used in the Veda. When the Rishi experiences this, what a wonder. As long as we live in this division, that there is a higher and there is a lower, our freedom lies in identification with the higher as opposed to the lower, disengaging ourselves from the lower. The moment we enter the lower, we find ourselves sucked into its limitation and incapacity. And so we are required to live in a partial experience of the divine consciousness, in what seems to be a freedom but is not a poise of mastery. The divine himself lives in that oneness, that infinity, formless, vast bliss, etc., and at the same time pours to become all this from a poise of mastery. Everything that he pours out to be is in full mastery of his energies, in perfect relation and alignment with everything else that is poured out from him with full intensity. He throws himself into his manifestation without fear of losing himself, without fear of being stuck and bound. And that's the true nature of the poise of mastery, to which we have to attain also. And that would be the true cosmic consciousness and the true freedom in participation, in engagement in life. So this is the ideal that Sri Aurobindo places before us. How to move to that? So remember, so far he has described an experience of the cosmic consciousness. Now we want to complete this. It is only an incomplete experience. We want to complete it. How do we move to this poise where we can be fully engaged in and participating from a poise of mastery? This becomes the theme of the next paragraph. So all this limitation and incapacity, he says, particularly in our embodied experience, the workings of mind, life and body are viewed from the calm and peace of the spiritual planes. And from there, they can be filled with the calm and peace. But they have not been possessed and they have not been subjected to the law of the all-mastering spirit. This is how the previous paragraph had ended. So we have a mind, we have a life, we have a body, into which from the spiritual heights, this calm, this peace pours in. In my action in the world, therefore, I may experience this calm and peace. I may be able to face circumstances with calm and peace, but not yet with the mastery. I may still be overwhelmed. I may still be crushed. I may still be unable to deal with, although calm and peaceful internally. So now in the next paragraph, this condition, this situation with the division, this is when the mental being takes its station in its own spiritual planes, in the mental planes of Sat, Chit, Ananda, and casts down their light and delight upon the lower existence. And this again we had discussed last time, what this means, this mental planes, subplane of Satchidananda. Remember, in the previous chapters, this whole question had been dealt with. If you enter directly into the pure Satchidananda, because there is nothing common to our human realm of consciousness, you will be in a state of trance, in the Satchidananda. You'll step out of it to re-enter the mind, life, body, you will lose the Satchidananda. You cannot seem to have both. The only way you can begin to experience is if in the mental domain you turn to its own higher gradations. And remember, the idea behind that was all these planes are within each other. Not only they are entire worlds in themselves, but within each world all of them are represented. So in the domain of mind there are parts, higher gradations of mind, they are still mind, which are not fully developed in us, but they are still present as a potential undeveloped grade. By becoming conscious in them, by developing and awakening in those planes, we can experience the Sat, Chit and Ananda in and through a mental consciousness. And so it is in such an experience that this limitation is had. I live in that, and yet my mind, life, body are in a calm and peace, but not in a poise of the all-mastering consciousness. From this higher level, they cast down their light and delight upon the lower existence. What's happening to the mind, life and body? Well, they're still there as vehicles, finite and limited, with whatever it was that I have grown with, or the best that I have been able to develop out of what I had, he says. But it is possible to attempt to arrive at a kind of cosmic consciousness by dwelling on the lower planes themselves, breaking their limitation laterally, as we have said, and calling down into them the light and largeness of the higher existence. See, the wording is very suggestive. He says, it is possible to attempt to arrive at a kind of cosmic consciousness. All of these modifiers, placing limitations, but still, it's possible to attempt at a kind of. So it won't be in itself the true cosmic consciousness. You can make an attempt, but it may not be quite the thing which you will get to. It's possible to try, but it may be extremely difficult. Okay. Now, all of this having been understood, we'll also see why it is so. The reality is, if you go from below, the way he's describing now, you can start here and try total consciousness, open out the vital consciousness, open out the physical, and try thus by breaking these boundaries to attain to some cosmic consciousness. What you will attain will be a kind of cosmic consciousness. You will never arrive at it completely, and the effort itself will be extremely difficult because you're starting with an incapacity, you're starting with an instrument which is itself the very opposite of what you're trying to reach at. If you want to cut a diamond, you could take a piece of bamboo and start scraping and keep on scraping for a few million years. It's going to take a long time. Even with a metal saw, after a while the saw will get blunted. Do you know how they cut diamond? With another diamond. Interesting. To cut a diamond, you need another diamond. Otherwise you can't. To arrive at a divine consciousness, you cannot think yourself into it with a mental consciousness. You cannot work yourself into it by running in the body. You see? You can only attain to it by divine consciousness. So if you start bottom up and laterally try to open out to a cosmic consciousness, all this you can understand now. It is possible to attempt to arrive at a kind of cosmic consciousness. But the reverse can be done. You can attain to that by the means already discussed earlier, into the spiritual and larger cosmic consciousness, and from there you can bring it down, to say. Use an already attained consciousness to turn upon the mind, life and body and work to remove its barriers. And yes, that would be possible. Not only possible, it would be much easier, and what it would reach to would be real and quite likely more complete. But so we're looking at it now this way and that way, from below up and from the top down, as we will go on. By dwelling on the lower plane themselves, so focus will be right here in this mind, life, body, breaking their limitations laterally. So I'm going to try to widen my mind, widen my life energies, widen the body consciousness. And as we have said, calling down into them the light and largeness of the higher existence. And so it's as if my mind turns up and feels this higher possibility and aspires to bring it down or calls it down so that it can fill and awaken in me something of its character. And this is possible for a reason, and he explains now why. Not only spirit is one, but mind, capital M, life, capital L, and matter, capital M, are one. So we have suddenly a different picture. So far we saw spirit as oneness and all these as somehow fragmented, finite pieces in collision. But if you look at the totality of mind and all the fragmentations in it, the totality of mind itself is a continuum. The totality of life energies is a continuum. The totality of matter is a continuum. They also are one. You cannot say mind is one with life or life is one with matter. They are distinct. But within themselves they seem to be one. There is one cosmic mind, one cosmic life, one cosmic body. Except that there's nothing in us which is able to somehow to tune into that directly. But now he explains how this relates to our limited experience. All the attempt of man to arrive at universal sympathy, universal love, and the understanding and knowledge of the inner soul of other existences is an attempt to beat thin, breach, and eventually break down by the power of the enlarging mind and heart the walls of the ego and arrive nearer to a cosmic oneness. So here we come to one of the most profound and powerful impulses of the human spirit, which is what makes humanity great. And this is the impulse to arrive at universal sympathy, universal love, and understand and know the inner soul of other existences. Three things. Sympathy first. We have sympathy. Easiest among siblings, among parent and child, within the family. It's easy. A little larger among friends, but that takes time also. And a little larger perhaps in time as we grow older, we begin to empathize, sympathize and so on. The realm and the scope broadens. Not the same for all, does not happen automatically necessarily. But it is there. We may consciously cultivate it, as in many religious traditions. We may consciously cultivate it because of some impulse within us that says, but I should be able to, I want to. Where did that impulse come from? Somewhere inside you. Why? Because it senses that this represents a deeper truth, a deeper reality of myself. If I am unable to feel this sympathy with others, I am narrow, I am limited, I am incomplete. And the more I am able to feel this sympathy, I feel myself free, I feel myself large, I feel myself more complete, because everybody is as if myself. And this push, this impulse is nothing but an inner truth known and felt deep within, which wants to now express and find its outer manifestation. Universal sympathy. It won't stop with just my family, my tribe, my nation. It must include everything. In the Buddhist tradition, they will speak of all sentient beings. Now, what does that include? Not only humans, but also animals and trees and perhaps even beings on other planets, which we may have no idea of. All sentient beings. Suddenly your mind opens out, all over the universe there are sentient beings. All of them are suffering, and that's the starting point of the Buddhist approach. There is suffering. It's the one thing you cannot avoid. The universe is full of that. All sentient beings are suffering. And to all those sentient beings, to get them free of that suffering, to give them some freedom in some liberation of some kind. But the goal is, in the very thought, a universal sympathy. The second is universal love. Now you see the distinction between sympathy and love. In a sympathy, you resonate, you support, but somehow you're separate. In a love, you give yourself. Perhaps even you lose yourself to some degree. You experience an identification to some degree. And so it seems to go beyond merely sympathy. When you love someone or something, suddenly there's a call to unite or to give oneself. Or if it is more egocentric, to absorb the other into oneself. To possess and annihilate separation. The mother observes in the lower gradations of nature, it takes the form of eating. The snake reaches out to eat its prey. And the whole movement is in fact a very loving absorption of the other into oneself. She notes how, I think she observed it in a zoo. There was a snake and they had put some animal to be eaten by the snake as food. First the animal was afraid, and after a while it became quiet, and then it gave itself and was eaten. And the whole experience is one of merging of consciousness. She points out it is the same love which you experience, which is experienced in atoms and molecules, which brings them together to bind and to create complex structures. You've seen pictures perhaps of complex chains of molecules and things represented. What brings them together is the same love felt in the very particles of matter. More overt in an emotional response, less obvious in plant, more obvious in animals, but always growing, always attempting for a greater completeness. It is the same which takes on a crude form of the bond among parent and child or among family. And as we become more awake, more conscious and more refined in consciousness, it broadens and widens out. No more based on instinct, but on a deeper awakening. And as this grows, one sees that it is towards all. It's not enough to have it to a few. They have it to another, they have it to another. There's a chain linking us all. Why cannot I experience that? And you'll see in the human experience, it sometimes takes this form where you say, whoever is your friend is my friend. Now extend that, whoever you love, I love. If you just accept this one principle, suddenly, poof, through the chain of entanglements, you love all things. Because everything is somehow, somewhere related. But somewhere inside us, there is also this need to reach out to love and be loved in a cruder form. The need for love is greater than the need to give love. The mother explains, if you observe the phenomenon, it's not the love that you receive from others which makes you happy, but the love that you give. You see this often in human relations. So and so is in love with me. Oh, what a pest. Because I don't feel the same, right? The love you receive is nice, but up to a point. After some time it becomes intrusive, dominating, oppressive even. But when you want to give it, then it is what makes you always joyous. If it is not accepted or if it is rejected, you may have a reaction. But if the love has within it a desire and a claim, if you can filter out the desire and the claim, then just the pure self-giving is a fulfillment in itself. And that is the pure love. And very quickly you realize it is not attached to a particular form. The same thing equally glows out to all beings, maybe differently. But in its purity, it can glow to all things. I'll share with this here in this experience. I've mentioned it before on other occasions, but it would be the right time to share again. When I had completed my studies in the ashram school and I had started working in the ashram archives, every morning I would go with my teacher, MP Pandit, to the ashram. Following his routine, I would go there, we would go to the meditation hall. Then I would meet him in his office and bow before leaving for my work. And as I bowed, he touched my forehead with his finger. And I felt something happy, beautiful, and I went. Over a few weeks, over a few months, I don't know, the experience was deepening, and I didn't realize when and how. Every time that he touched, it was as if in the contact, I saw a ball of liquid golden light entering and gently dropping into my heart, and in my heart bursting, poof. And as it burst out, everything was suddenly so beautiful. And everything was so alive, so conscious, and full of love. And from my heart there was a love, and in all things, from all things there was a love, very gentle, soft, pure. And I could look at people, things, think of people. Even my favorite enemy is the one I loved to feel as an enemy, Love was the defining thing. Other human relations were all subsidiary, secondary ripples with this. And it was very gentle and soft, so natural that it seemed to be the way things should always be. Cannot be otherwise. And so it built over a few weeks, months, years, I don't know when. It was always, the world was magical, sacred, beautiful, special, somehow. It's something of this kind of experience. This is the beginning of so much more that has to come. It's just the beginning. But it's a glimpse of this somewhere deep within that calls to us when we want to reach out and experience, give, receive, share, love. And all human love is only a mixed approximation, heavily mixed often with desire and claim of this, which really is the truth of our deepest soul and our deepest existence. And to have this universal love is the push in human beings which makes us widen and connect. Secretly, it's what drives all the widening of consciousness. And the third step, the understanding and knowledge of the inner soul of other existences. And you see how it leads naturally from this second. What is it that you love? Well, you can focus on certain forms. Oh, the way you look at me, the way you smile, the way you walk, the way you speak, and etc. But that's not it. Those are rather pegs on which you hang the experience of love. The love itself is, remove all that. You. That. And what is you? Remove all the forms. What is you? The essence that you are. If you were to discard your body, what would you be? If you were to discard your emotions and your mind, what would you be? That is what you are. Nothing can take away from you what you are. All these are covers, clothings you've put around it to be able to engage with the world and interface with people and forms. But you are that, which is what remains when you discard all this. And the love is from there and to that in others, even if you're not conscious of it. And so inevitably this turning of love prepares and leads to the need to understand and know this inner soul of other existences. And he uses the word existences, not just beings. Because at first it may be to humans that you feel most easily, but when you have that perception or that sensitivity, you find often you can feel it more easily in a flower or in a plant. Because they're so much more gentle and soft and pure. In the humans there's so much clutter, junk, agitation. And often those who have that deeper sensitivity would rather run away from humans and be trees and plants and flowers. The heart can open and be free without fear. But quickly you also sense it is not just in plants and flowers where it is easier, but in all things, even in the rocks, even in objects, in everything, all existences. And so this deeper turn, as one grows in awareness, in maturity, in evolution, it starts with a universal sympathy, grows to a need for universal love, and it eventually settles in this need to understand and know the inner soul of other existences. And says, all the attempt of man to arrive at these three things is in fact only an attempt to beat thin, breach and eventually break down the walls of the ego. The attempt goes through 3 degrees. Beat thin. Every experience is as if a nudge, a knock, a push, an effort. And over time it begins to thin out the ego. For most people that's good enough. I am now universal in my approach. I work for universal rights. I work for universal justice. I serve all human beings in my efforts. Good enough. The ego is still there, but it's thinned. But to go further would need a deeper call, a spiritual call. And at that point it's not beating thin, but breaks. The breaking of the ego, the breaching, is not enough. You have breached, made a hole, cut through passages. In this state of consciousness, during this activity, for the purpose of this commitment, I am universal. In my sympathy, in my love, or in my perception of the inner soul. Once I switch back from there, here, in these domains, it is me, my protection, my need. So the breaching is a starting point. Eventually, there has to be the breakdown. Eventually break down the walls of the ego. And that process may take time. In the normal evolutionary process, it may take a very long time. But in the yogic process, it may happen quite rapidly. Because one makes a conscious effort. Still, in fact, when one proceeds in this line, there comes a poise where breaches have happened, many breaches, but we are unable to free from the ego simply because we've defined ourselves in terms of the walls by the limitations. What is it like to have that removed? I wouldn't be. I wouldn't exist. Who will register? Who will appreciate? Who will experience? And the very need to hold a poise of experience and registration is a clinging to something of the walls of the ego. And it is at this point generally that the divine grace intervenes and comes and breaks. And if we have been rigidly attached, it can be painful sometimes. And you may even say, why are you putting me through this? I am so universal, so loving, so. But when it's completed and you finally experience the release, you realize, this is what it was. And you're grateful for it. You laugh. You thank that intervention. This transition is not easy for this reason only, because we don't know what it's like to be free. But always it starts with a thinning, breaching, and eventually breaking down. By what? By the power of the enlarging mind and heart. And this is the normal process of human effort. Your mind grows wider, your heart grows wider, and so you develop, etc. When you look at cultures, more developed and less developed, this characterizes, in a large part, the greater development of culture. When it is more universal in its sympathy, love, and deeper understanding of the soul of others. When it recasts all its social, political, administrative, governance, and other relations in terms of these things, to make them more universal. Declaration of universal rights. Wow, it's a big step. Putting them into practice, it takes a few centuries. Because you don't feel it. You have to try to live by an appearance of it, but you never really live it. And that needs a sadhana, a yoga. Anyway, but that defines the higher gradations of cultures often. But this enlarging mind, enlarging heart has a power, a push, and a persistence across time. The walls of the ego are thus broken down and arrive nearer to a cosmic oneness. You don't get to it, you just come nearer to it. And in the human experience, that's enough. But this is the setting he places for this breaking down of the walls laterally. He places in the context of this human need and human evolutionary drive. It's in fact pointing to cosmic consciousness. It can never get to it on its own, but that's what it's aiming at, unknowingly. Near to a cosmic oneness. And if we can, by the heart, by the mind and heart, get at the touch of the spirit, receive the powerful inrush of the divine into this lower humanity, and change our nature into a reflection of the divine nature, by love, by universal joy, by oneness of mind with all nature and all beings, we can break down the walls. So all these initial attempts, they will fail, they will only reach partial degrees, but we can break down these walls if we do this. And what he describes here is in fact the whole yogic process. First of all, there are two approaches to it, by the mind and by the heart. So temperamentally, some of us would begin by the mind reaching out. Some of us would begin by the heart reaching out. A few may practice both. But whichever you start with, eventually you would do both. So if we can, by the mind and heart, get at the touch of the spirit, how would you do that? With the mind, your mind turns to dwell on the spirit. Well, that's the theme of these chapters of the yoga of integral knowledge. The next section, the yoga of love through the heart. But whatever, first point of contact to some touch of the spirit. What touch, which aspect, it doesn't matter which. Whatever is easiest for your mind, for your heart, for your nature, for your need, for the turn of your aspiration. Doesn't matter what form it takes. But get to the touch of the spirit. That is the one consciousness filling the whole universe and the cosmos and transcending it. Conceive of it as the one presence that fills everything in space and in time and exceeds both space and time, pouring into space and time from outside it. Such would be the conception of the spirit. What is your relation with it? You can conceive of it as a divine love pouring into space and time, filling everything. You can conceive of it as a divine power that pours and fills. You can conceive of it as a divine peace that fills and supports. You can conceive of it as an ethereal vastness underlying everything. You can conceive of it as a very personal divine presence. Literally, the flow of the divine energy in all things, which is conscious of you and forms all things and is in you and outside you and in all things, and relate to her as a divine universal mother. Whatever form you feel most helpful, you first set up this link, this relationship. Get at the touch of the spirit. Once that touch is made, it's a passage, it's a two-way connection. From it, receive the powerful inrush of the divine into this lower humanity. So the next step, once the contact is made, is through the contact, that which is higher pours into this which is lower. Remember, we could never have done it on our own. We cannot think ourselves into divinity. But we can, through that contact, receive the inrush of the divine consciousness. And when it rushes, then it may take various forms and aspects again, depending on the nature of the relation and the call. It may be as if a peace that pours into you, or a light, or a power, or a vastness, or a love, or a quiet joy. Any or all of these forms fill us. The third step, change our nature into a reflection of the divine nature. So what happens is, we were this, that was that. As that pours into this, it begins to recast, reconstitute. And this happens quite spontaneously. And especially when taken through this process, it can happen very rapidly. Sometimes one has the experience, even within a few days or weeks, that one has changed so much that at first it may be a little unstable. There are parts in us which may not be fully participating, and one finds oneself falling back as if, and then again falling forward and back, a kind of an oscillation, until those parts not yet receiving directly get suffused with this. Each time you fall back, it's as if something of what you have experienced soaks into those parts which didn't receive. And so a kind of a merging takes place until no more the oscillation remains, only a stable poise on a new level. And your whole nature is transformed. Spontaneously, you feel this, you sense this, you experience it, you live by it now. Your thinking has changed, your emotions, your relationships have changed. Somehow where earlier, your family was your defining closeness, it seems so superficial, so meaningless. What is it that you feel closeness with? Well, everywhere that there is this aspiration, everywhere there is the sense of the sacred or the yearning for the sacred, that's my family, that's my space. the whole meaning of relationships undergoes a change. And one goes through this relatively rapidly. What normally in evolution would have taken many hundreds of lives can even happen within a few years. But always it is the result of the inpouring of that divine into the humanity. Change our nature into a reflection of the divine nature by love, by universal joy, by oneness of mind with all nature and all things. So as this change takes place, what you discover is there is this increase of these things, and as these things grow in you, the nature changes even more. And it supports, each feeds into the other. So by love, increasingly as you grow conscious of it, it widens out and the walls begin to break down. By this universal joy, which you begin to perceive or share or relate to, again there's the widening. By the oneness of mind, you begin to sense that your own mind is only like a little island in a universal mind in which all are islands. And somehow the consciousness widens and feels this continuum with all nature and all beings and walls. Even our bodies are not really separate entities. So far he has looked at the mind and the heart. What happens to this material substance and the body consciousness? Even our bodies are not really separate entities, and therefore our very physical consciousness is capable of oneness with the physical consciousness of others and of the cosmos. Now again in the wording, very suggestively, Sri Aurobindo doesn't say it will happen. He says it is capable of. In fact, it doesn't always happen. Therefore, our physical consciousness is capable of oneness with the physical consciousnesses of others and of the cosmos. What normally happens is in the mind there is this widening most easily, in the heart there is this widening, and these two are so full, so overwhelming that it feels as if even in the physical consciousness you are one, but you are not conscious of your body in fact. Your awareness of the body is your mind's awareness of the body sensations, your heart's awareness of the body feeling. They being universal, it feels as if your body sensation also has this universality, but it's not so. That requires a certain work. And if not consciously done, often is skipped. Well, because it doesn't even feel necessary, because you're so full with the other two layers. When one works upon it consciously, then one finds, oh yes, this brings a much deeper degree and vividness and completeness to that experience of universality. Ramakrishna Paramahansa, you will recall, had this spontaneously whipped in front of him. He looks at the bullock and there is a spontaneous identity in the physical consciousness. Now if it was merely in the mental or vital consciousness, you would say, ouch, that hurts. As we all do. If you see a bullock being whipped violently, something in you shrinks, you feel the hurt of it. That would be an identification in the emotional level. What did he experience? He felt the pain of the whip on his back and shouted in the pain. And the marks of the whip formed on his back. That would be the nature of the physical identification. With what? Everything. At that moment, because his mind dwelt on the bullock, there was the spontaneous identification on the physical. But for one who lives in that consciousness, the whole universe is as if your body. And all human beings are as if in you. Now one can, of course, it doesn't mean you're overwhelmed. One can modulate the extent to which one may hold or engage with that identification. Even in a universal mind, your mind may be freed, but you may choose to hold a practical focus. In the practical focus, you can choose to turn attention to anything, but for practical reasons, you may hold it to a narrower space. When you need, you may widen to something specific, but the consciousness is free. even though your attention may be put on a limited focus. And so it can be with the physical body also. We may hold a practical focus on which we may put a conscious intention. The mother did this, in fact, with the disciples in the ashram, especially in the early years of the ashram, when she would hold each person in herself at the physical, at the emotional, at the mental, and the spiritual levels, all inclusive. To such a degree that things that happened to their body would be felt by her. The entire space of the ashram, including not just the people, but even the plants and animals and even the buildings, were part of her physical consciousness. The result was, of course, not always convenient. She had given strict instructions that in the main building of the ashram, nothing is to be changed without her explicit permission. And there were many reasons. This was one of the reasons. I don't know if you've ever had this experience. Of course, as I gave the earlier, you see an animal beaten, you feel the shock on you. If you've seen a tree being cut, the hacking, each blow on the tree, some part of us feels it. But something similar is felt when you break a building, especially if that is a part of your consciousness. It can hit you physically, hurt you physically. But there's something more. This was narrated to me by one of her attendants who was seated near her at the playground, and he saw the mother scratching her arm furiously and with some disgust. And he turned, and mother explained to him, she said, such and such a person in the ashram was indulging in an act of falsehood. She used some word. The fact that the person was deliberately participating in an activity in his consciousness which was false, contrary to all this space represented, was registering on her body physically. It's not a very nice thing, obviously, but that was the nature of her commitment in the assistance given in the sadhana. So even our bodies are not really separate entities, and therefore our physical consciousness is capable of oneness. So the logic here is, we think we are separate, but actually if you observe carefully, there is a continuous exchange taking place. So this is easy to see at the level of thoughts and emotions. You walk into a marketplace and the energies of the people around, well, they just pass right through you, changing your energies, changing your emotions. Try this as an example. You enter a space which is full of strong desire and greed, and then try to remember the divine. Difficult. You enter a temple space where everybody has been praying, and you try to remember the divine. Oh yeah, it's the most natural thing, so easy. Why? Because of this rush of the emotion, energy, mind formation, thought formation. We are not conscious of how much we are influenced by these environmental states of awareness. In fact, the very first thing one needs to do is to create a space in our life in which we imprint our ideals, our highest thoughts, feelings, emotions, and vibes. A pure space, ideally in our own home or in a part of our house. To be able to establish that is a great help, because now you have a supportive environment. If that can be widened at the level of a community, that is an even greater help, because then there's a mutuality which supports, and that's the whole purpose of a community. Communities like this. But the idea is you have a space. Entering that space, everything becomes easier and the contact is closer and easier. But this, at the level of the body, we are not conscious. Not only there's an exchange of energies physically. If you sit close to a lot of people, you're watching a movie together, standing, listening to a lecture, there's a certain energy which flows across. And very quickly it forms alignments, which makes for a shift in behavior until the whole group begins to behave like one person. They call it crowd psychology. But what it basically says is, once the entanglement of energy is deep enough, the whole moves as one, because it's one energy body. And a person, most politicians, have this kind of a skillful charisma that they can play with the group energy. Often they will create deliberately circumstances for enhancing the group bonding before they come on the scene to play with the energy. So there are many kinds of activities they may have you go through as a group in preparation for that event, where they can then hold you and play with you. But again, all of this is still at an energy in the body. But in the body itself, there is something happening. The most obvious is the gross material of the body, which is the food that you eat, which goes out as food for others. Maybe to the plants, but through the plant to others. Now if you think about this, over a few million years, the food you have eaten was formed by the plant. What came out of your body is now already a refined material. It is not like sand. The tree took sand and turned it to fruit. The fruit you ate came out of your body after digestion in a material which is already highly more nutritious and alive than sand, and goes to form in soil the rich biome that allows more life to grow. If you observe this process, you're seeing a transformation of gross physical matter, first through plant and then through other living bodies, and then an exchange in which the whole thing is being raised to higher and higher gradations of a living mass or semi-living mass, more conscious, more refined, much more subtle matter. And our body is actually a part of this mass in the universe, not just energetically but physically. If you shift now to a place where this rich mass has not been sufficiently developed, quickly the body hardens, becomes coarse, crude. You live in a desert long enough where this rich mass has not formed. Your body becomes hardened, coarsened and rigidified. You live in a place which is full of this extreme natural fertility of the soil, and your body becomes more soft, fresh, conscious. We can feel the brightness. So there is a connection which actually makes your body a part of the whole physical domain and connects to other living bodies, all the way down to the most gross material substance of the soil. It's the reason why if you eat food from locally grown materials, that energy flow is more complete, more healthy than if you take from another energy source with which your body is not so easily aligned. When you think of it in these terms, it's so obvious, isn't it? And so he says, even our bodies are not really separate entities, and therefore our very physical consciousness is capable of oneness with the physical consciousness of others and of the cosmos. The yogin is able to feel his body one with all bodies, to be aware of and even to participate in their affections. He can feel constantly the unity of all matter and be aware of his physical being as only a movement in its movements. So if you enter the physical consciousness, you will experience the substance of the universe as this gigantic whirling movement, and inside that your body is one movement whirling in this larger whirl, and all other bodies, parts of this big whirl. And then even this grows to the sea of life as an infinite life, unite in mind and heart with all things and all beings in their desires, struggles, joys and thoughts, as if they were his own, as if occurring in his larger self. And so this is the theme. Maybe I'll just read and we will discuss this in greater detail next time. Still more is it possible for him to feel constantly and normally the whole sea of the infinite life as his true vital existence. And his own life is only a wave of that boundless surge. And more easily yet is it possible for him to unite himself in mind and heart with all existences, be aware of their desires, struggles, joys, sorrows, thoughts, impulses, in a sense as if they were his own. You feel what's happening in them as if it's happening in you, because you are in them, or rather they are in you. At least as occurring in his larger self, hardly less intimate or quite as intimate as the movements of his own heart and mind. This too is a realization of cosmic consciousness. Now you can see what was being discussed earlier at the spiritual level has been as if brought down all the way into the human embodiment, and the cosmicity on these three levels are as if joining with the cosmic, spiritual, divine consciousness. And the impact of this and the meaning of this is taken up in the next paragraph. But this portion we have just read needs further elaboration, which we will continue next Friday. We can pause here and take up any comments or questions. The question is, in children often one sees a light which quickly as they grow and even may be lost. Is it possible for it to come back? If you observe the reason for the dimming, as their personality grows, it forms layers. If the layers are formed in a way that they cover and they conceal, that they live for their own desire, for their own instinct, for their own impulse, or some false external desires, instincts and impulses, not aligned to the light within, then the layers grow to cover the light. If from the beginning, in the formation of these layers, in the education itself, the child was made conscious of the light and the values of its influence formed those layers, then the very same layers would be representing the light and expressing it rather than concealing it. Such would be ideally the education we would want our children to have. But unfortunately, the system is completely perverted to do the very opposite. Sri Aurobindo even refers to the educational system currently as an asuric education. Asuric because it turns you away from the divine, turns you away from your own soul and submits you to the very opposite influences. The result is, as the personality is completed in its formation, the light is completely concealed as if lost. But it is still there inside. And from inside must work through reflections and indirect multiple reflections to slowly push and nudge the personality in some meaningful direction through a slow, painful and often suffocating life experience. It can be brought forward by two things. First, if it is already mature enough inside to be able to break through, maybe find an occasion of a life crisis when the external personality is shaken up, momentarily weakened in its rigidity, and it pushes forward a strong urge. Or it calls for help for the divine, from the divine, and from the divine comes a knock from outside, pushing through from outside as it pushes out from inside. And there's a crushing or breaking, often painful through a shock. And so something is broken and it can then begin to have a larger play, however slowly. This is one way. Or, if we're fortunate, if in the formation of the personality or in the contact with some external environment or influence, a positive support is given. Sometimes it can be one person. So if in my childhood I've had this light, it's now been covered up, I'm in my normal wandering somnambulistic life, I'm basically sleepwalking, driven by desires and impulses. I suddenly meet somebody and I feel, oh, your presence reminds me of something which I've forgotten. I don't know what it is. But I like to be with you because it makes me feel good. Something inside me stirs, I don't know what. And maybe by that repeated contact, it creates an environment in which the personality now starts to feel a lack and call, and may even by conscious instruction may be reminded that it had a light or it has the light, and may choose to participate willingly and turn to find the light. That would be a more obvious awakening taking place, often by an external support and trigger, but of the thing which was already there. And then quickly that can come forward and the link is formed from the inside and outside. That would be a more healthy way to recover. The less healthy way would be through the breaking of the personality, shattering and shock. But the ideal would be that the formation of these layers itself would be done in an alignment to the light, and it is never lost. It will lead always. No, there is a joy in receiving also. Of course, there is a joy in receiving. But the greater joy is in giving. And the mother puts it thus. I will spell out the exact quotation. She says, it is always the love that you give. That makes you happy, because the love that you give is the love that you receive from the divine, who loves eternally and unfailingly. And the recognition is the source of the love itself is from deep within the soul, which itself is like a reflector for the love which is of the divine. The soul, being a part of the divine consciousness, becomes as if its purest receptacle to receive the love and to pour out. But in the very act of giving, what you're doing is receiving. And it is that which is giving you the joy. But that reception directly from the divine is the purest joy. When the same may reflect through other souls and come, if there is the perception of the divine source of it, then that joy also is there in the receiving. When the perception of the divine as the source is not so clear, the joy may be mixed with certain expectations and demands, which may cause often the mixture and the confusion that follows. In the same way as the giving, if it is not pure in its awareness, in its source, it mixes with desire and claim, which again distorts and leads to other problems. But seen in this way, the whole play of the universe unfolding is a play of the divine love, playing out through reflections and colors, through so many forms. Where the whole experience, both of giving and receiving, is meant to be an aspect of the play. You will see little children, the games they play, which give them so much joy, little babies, are all representing this play of the divine. Little baby, you cover your face, and he laughs. What is the laugh? The hiding and the revealing of the divine from himself. That's what is this whole human experience about. The concealment, and then the rediscovery. The losing of the contact, and then the refinding of it. But this is the game. And the other play, you throw the ball, you bounce and it hits, you bounce and you take it back. It's so much fun for the child. What are you doing? You're exchanging. What? From the heart, the love. In different colors, in different shapes, in different movements, in different forms. And everything boils down to just this: hide and seek and exchange of the divine delight. Very symbolic, very profound at that age. There are no other games, finally, other than these. They are all variations of these. We'll continue this next Friday then. Oh.